to another episode of English Unplugged. My name is Britt Breu.
And my name is nick.ponter. I'm a business English trainer from the area of Ostwestfalen, focusing on assisting companies. I'm also a published author of fantasy books. And Britt and I are back for another informative video. Britt, it's always lovely to work with you. What's today's topic, Britt?
Today's topic is formality, sometimes known in language training circles as register. So today what we want to do is provide you not only with some language tips on how to use appropriate formality for the situation, we also want to give you a few intercultural communication tips, and hopefully you'll be able to take that away and use appropriate register when speaking and writing English.
Sounds like a good plan. And yes, I agree. Formality is, I mean, it's intercultural. It's much more than just using different words, although that's also very important. And I think today we're going to mainly focus on spoken English, so formality in the spoken language, but we're not going to forget writing tips as well. There'll also be some of those coming along.
Right, right. So the main focus will be on spoken English, but a few writing tips are in the mix as well. So, Nick, when we talk about formality or register, how do you understand this and how do you work with this concept when you are training your students?
Well, when I train my students, it's very much on a practical level. And we also have to accept the fact that English is a relatively informal language. And I think the biggest difference to German is that we like to use first names and very quickly as well. Very different to German, which is much more Herr und Frau. English, not necessarily so. We're much, much quicker in using first names and to different levels of people, unlike in German. And the biggest tip I always give to people is not rude in English to address people with their first names. It's sometimes uncomfortable for non-English speakers, but it's absolutely fine most of the time to use first names.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Except, of course, if you are talking to a person who has an official governmental title or something like that. It's one piece of advice I always give students when they're traveling to the United States, that they address the immigration officers with sir or madam. Yes, sir. Yes, madam. Yes, ma'am. A little bit of formality and respect goes a long way in the right situations. And of course, if you have a chance meeting with the mayor of your city, then you would say something like Mr. or Mrs. Mayor, something like that. Yeah, but generally speaking, in other situations that are more formal, like an institution, academic institution, for example, a university or something like that, it's not common in the English language to address someone who has a PhD or a doctorate by the title, the academic title doctor. So, generally speaking, in an academic situation, you would also still use the first name in that case in English speaking countries. Even though it does feel a little strange, I've had students at the university call me professor or doctor, which is very flattering and very, very sweet. I don't hold an academic title at that level, but in their culture, it's very appropriate to show respect through the use of formal titles. So English is very, very, very different than a lot of other languages like German, the culture and language that we live and speak in. So if you're unsure, the best thing is to do just ask the person, may I call you by your first name? Right?
Is a very good tip. Yes, and this is a question which I am asked very often in my business English lessons. For example, I remember a case a few years ago. Somebody, oh, Nick, can you help me? The boss of the company wrote to me and called me, hey, Linda, or something like that. How should I reply? And I said,
Mm.
well, what's his name? Mr. No, no, what's his name? Greg. Well, if he calls you Hey Linda, for example, then with me it'd be okay to write back Hey Greg. Now for German speakers, that might be uncomfortable to do that because it's not normal. But it is okay if you're unsure, maybe compromise by saying Dear Greg. or whatever their
Mm,
name may be. And that might be a good way of getting around the problem. But it's certainly not rude in English if somebody has already used your first name to counter it with their first name as well. It's absolutely fine in the English language.
that's right. That's right. And the other tip I can add to that is also, we're talking about a situation where you would be writing an email for the first time to a person. And if you're unsure, I always advise my students to start more formally and then adjust your level of register or formality when the person writes back to you. And when the person writes back to you, you see, okay, did they open the email with "Hey Linda"? And if they open with "Hey Linda," you can write back "Hey Greg," no problem. If the person stays a little more formal, and very typically in business emails, it's a good mix of formality and friendliness. So you will have a first name basis with more formal language, but the general advice is simply be a mirror to the person you're communicating with. And if they address you by your first name, you are more than allowed to address them by their first name. You agree?
What I often do is when I write an email, maybe to somebody for the first time, and I'm writing formal because it's the first time, I would usually finish it with like maybe best regards and Nick. And then underneath that,
Right.
I've got my formal signature block. So I'm offering my first name. Um,
Right. Exactly. I do exactly the same thing. And I think with you and I as native speakers, we could generalize it and say that is an unspoken invitation for the other person to use your first name. And most people will sign their emails with first names, but we shouldn't always be so informal. Isn't that right, Nick?
I agree. I mean, there's a time and a place for everything. For example, if you're
Mm,
applying for a job, and even if you know somebody's first name, I certainly wouldn't write to somebody, "Dear Greg," if I'm applying for a job. Then I would go probably to the highest formality you're going to have. And if I was writing a job application, for example, or as you've already mentioned, to an institute, then I would go to the top level, like "Dear Sir" or "Madam," or in a, and that's British English, American English, "Dear ladies and gentlemen," or "To whom it may concern." And these are the highest forms of formality. Everything in life has its right place and the right time,
that's
and this is
right.
one of them.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So, and do remember that if you address an email or a piece of writing with the most formal salutation or opening, you should also close with a very formal closing. And I believe in British English, that's "Yours faithfully." It's not used very often at
The
all.
Americans may different. Yeah.
And in the US, it's "Sincerely yours," of course. And if you're on a semi-formal basis with someone, then of course, "Kind regards," "Best regards," or simply "Regards" will do as a closing for an email. But uh, it's best to know those levels of formality so that you can make a really good first impression. And that's why it's so important to be aware of register or formality um, when you are aware of what is the most formal way of addressing a person, either in a conversation or in a piece of writing, it shows that you understand the nuance of the language, and it also shows that you understand a little bit about the culture and what's appropriate in that culture. So it's not just a language skill, but it's also an intercultural skill because that you're demonstrating that you are aware of social norms and etiquette.
And on the subject of social norms and etiquette, language always goes through change. It always has. I mean, if I was to watch Downton Abbey and I look at the formality of the language of that compared to the language we have today, it's completely different. Do you think we're becoming much more informal? I mean, especially with the social media culture, for example.
I would definitely say that language, all in all, has become a lot less formal, and formal standards of language have definitely become looser and
Mhm.
possibly have dropped because of internet culture, social media, blogging. There just is an abundance, and one could even say there's an overabundance of written information and now videos that have some kind of message. And because of the sheer amount and volume of written text that we encounter, people are always looking for shortcuts.
Mm,
So we've seen the birth of texting or short message language, direct message language, and you can possibly think of a few abbreviations like LOL or
mm.
something like that. There's a few that are uh, a little too racy for YouTube, but people abbreviate to save time. And this obviously being formal in your communication takes more time, it takes more words, it takes more space, and it takes more effort. So I do think that the level of formality has gone down. Also, the internet is full of humor, and humor isn't necessarily very formal. So, but languages always go through change, and I think globalization has also played a big part. The internet is a big part of globalization, but we now have a global English that we use and speak on the internet, and it is used and produced by many, many speakers. Most of them are non-native speakers. So the level of formality will very naturally and organically change as it's used by more and more people and also in new contexts. And we have technology that we didn't have 30, 40 years ago. We had to come up with names for these things. And so language is constantly changing. How do you talk about that with your students?
Well, we discuss things like that, but one of the easiest things to do is actually put it into the world of writing, and let's say
Mhm.
writing emails to people. And the use of vocabulary is the strongest indicator for jumping between the different registers. I mean, you mentioned social media, the shortcuts and things. Okay, in the right place. And if you're chatting to a
Mhm.
colleague informally in a company, why not? If you're writing to a supplier or a customer, and other people are going to be copied in, and it's not a personal, like, daily relationship you have with somebody, then you need to think about your word choice. And
Mm.
we said it at the beginning, we're also going to touch on writing, and here we are now, some writing tips. And it's not only maybe your sentence structure, you could be a little bit more formal, but we as trainers can teach people different levels of words.
That's it. That's it. And what I always teach, it's kind of a silly example, but I teach the five finger rule and the five-letter rule. And if anything, any word that you use is under five letters, then it's most likely an informal word. And especially with verbs, phrasal verbs, etc. Phrasal verbs are generally considered to be less formal, and there are always more formal variants or synonyms for these words. So phrasal verbs are a smaller basic verb like get or wake up or carry or something like that, plus a preposition or a particle. So it's a small package or group of smaller words bundled together with a specific meaning. Wake up, stand up, turn off, things like this are phrasal verbs. And those are generally informal. So when you're using or you would like to have a more formal register in writing, we would suggest obviously using verbs and also nouns that are a little bit more sophisticated. And should we give the viewers a couple of examples just so they know what we're talking about?
Are you going to start with informal or formal? Have I got to
I'll
be?
I'll start with the informality because
So
I'm
I've
the
got to be formal.
American.
I'll be
Yes,
formal.
you're British. You sound more formal. I sound more
Okay, let's be
informal.
formal then, shall we, Britt?
Yes. Um, I'll give you the example of the informal verb, and then you can give us an example of a more formal synonym. All right. So, how about the verb get?
To receive.
To
Please get
receive.
the spelling correct.
Yes, that's
Receive.
right. That's right. That's right. I before E except after C.
I remember.
What about the verb to need?
I need something much nicer to say. I Sounds
I
much better.
recall. Yes, it definitely does. It definitely does. What about the verb to tell someone something?
Sounds a bit direct. Okay, in informal language, in emailing, inform somebody.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly. There are so many synonyms for tell. It is also really dependent upon the context. So you need to look into that and make sure that you're using the right synonym in the appropriate context. Okay, and then to finish off, what about the verb to help?
Assist or
To
support.
ass
Also nice.
assist,
Yes.
support. Very, very nice. Very,
And
very
there are
nice. So
many other ones which you can use. I mean, we haven't listed it here, but for example, is the meeting appointment okay for you? Is it suitable for you? I mean, there are many, many other words which we could use.
that's right. That's right. And generally speaking, a more formal word, expression, or phrase will generally tend to be a bit longer. So,
Of course, as well
um,
in German, where most of the people who teach German, they have the same differences in German as well. Like brauchen and benötigen is exactly the same. We as language
right.
families, they give different choices of words in English to help people along the way.
Right, right. And I mean, this level of nuance is found in almost every language on the planet. So this is nothing new to English. But since we're English trainers, we have to give tips specific to the English language. And one other tip that I can pass along, and I know that you're aware of this too, but the Oxford Online Learners Dictionary actually has a level of formality, or more specifically, the proficiency level that each vocabulary word entry in that dictionary is assigned to. So here in Europe, we use the CEFR levels, the Common European Reference Framework. And B1 is considered to be intermediate. So the scale goes from A1 up to C1, A1 being a beginner level, and C2, excuse me, C2 being a native speaker level. So the tip that I give my students is when you're looking at the words in the Oxford Learners Dictionary online, is to look for what CEFR level has been assigned to that word. And if it's B1, okay, that's passable as a little bit more formal, semi-formal perhaps, but aim for words that are B2, C1, or C2 in terms of the level of formality and sophistication. Yeah. And these are the words that you would use in more formal business writing, a report, a presentation, academic writing, something like that. Not necessarily a quick direct message or short message to a colleague that you're quite friendly with, or your mom or your partner or your child or something like that, obviously. So,
Exactly.
yes, yes.
And you mentioned as well that in using like technology, like the online dictionary, in our last video, we spoke about AI and AI tools as a form
That's
of
right.
learning. And this fits in perfectly with what you're talking about, Britt. If you like the different levels of language, you can actually, for example, use AI to help you write an email, and you can actually instruct it, say, please write it in a more formal style. You could actually say in a B2 style or a C1 style. The important thing is, as we discussed in our last video, is to actually
Mhm.
use it as a learning tool rather than
Correct.
just a functional tool to get the job done. Uh,
Correct.
because then you're not going to
Correct.
learn anything about the language. So it's getting this different as well. But as you said, online dictionary, AI tools, also wonderful.
That's right. And we'll post the link to that video here so that you can click onto that and get a couple of tips on how to practice and improve your level of English using all of the amazing AI tools that are out there. That was a really fun video to make.
Well,
So, and on the note, we'll just wrap up writing with one last tip that I'd like to point out. Because of the amount of information that we come across, another beautiful phrasal verb, more formal, encounter online, is the fact that most of us now write in very short bursts. So emails use very, very short paragraphs. Social media posts use very, very short paragraphs. Blogs use very, very short paragraphs. And this is in order to improve the readability and also the click away rate, right? So this is all based in search engine optimization and all of that. When you're writing in a more formal situation, like a business report or an academic paper or something like that, and this holds true in most languages, paragraphs are at least 4 sentences long, if not more, where the ideas are grouped together in one paragraph. So do be mindful about that as well when you are writing a little more formal piece of information.
Yes.
So, okay, Nick. So, do we have any other tips now for the viewers out there?
Yeah, I would definitely say, I mean, the English language is definitely very strong in using modals.
Mm,
Because, I mean, you already said that if your language is too direct, I mean, it may be effective. Some people may consider it rude or impolite. So, in the English language, most of you listening to this will already know we love our woulds and coulds and shoulds and mays and mights. And we just it softens the directness of the language. It makes everything more flexible, and I just have to say, it sounds nicer. Some
that's
people would say
it.
the English sentences are full of too much blah blah, but it's part of the culture, and language is culture, and we can make even a direct message very soft by using modal verbs. For example, I would disagree, rather than just saying I think you're wrong. I mean, the modal verbs can send the same message, but in a much much nicer way. Um,
That's right.
have you got any other language tips? Any other tricks
Well,
people could use?
I'm glad you mentioned the way that the English language tends to soften a direct message to make it a little easier, hopefully, for the counterpart to hear. And oftentimes, the British culture, more so than the American culture,
Hmm.
is considered to be generally more low context or more high context, excuse me, high context meaning you need a little bit of background knowledge and experience to understand what is actually being said. And English is still pretty straightforward compared to some Asian cultures and things like that. But British culture and the Americans to some degree are more high context than, say, the German culture. So the use of modal verbs, like you said, can soften a very direct message and make it a little bit more pleasant for the general atmosphere of the conversation. So that's something also that needs to be taken account in terms of a more formal situation will generally be more polite and higher context than a very quick direct message over Slack or Teams or something like that. It's a general rule that we've talked about earlier. The more formal the situation is, usually the longer the piece of communication will be. So, and being too direct is considered impolite, and no one wants to be rude. So it's important to use those modal verbs, Nick, wouldn't you say?
I agree
What about
completely.
you would agree completely, wouldn't
I would
you?
agree
Uh,
completely. Yes. I couldn't disagree with you.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love it. I teach this all the time and it's so much fun. One other tip that we could talk about is the passive voice, no?
I believe so. The passive voice is a wonderful tool to take away the personal in language.
Okay, can you expand a little bit more on the personal in language?
Yeah, I mean, a personal in language is if you write I or we, the focus is very much on that. I mean, it may be okay if you want to give good news, so you get the credit for it. But let's say there's bad news, maybe, and you don't want to
Mm,
use I or we as a company, then you could turn it around and use the passive. Just an
that's right.
example, I could be very direct and say, Britt, you made a mistake. I mean, that ooh, in writing, that like shouts out at you, you made a mistake, is blaming somebody.
Yes.
But this you is the personal, which can be
Yes.
direct, it can be indirect. In this context, it's very direct. You could turn it around with a passive and say, a mistake has been made. It's not important by whom, and it's a much
Right.
nicer way of actually bringing across the message without any finger pointing.
Correct, correct, which is something that you would want to avoid. There, I used another modal verb. You would want to avoid this. For example, if you were communicating with a customer who hasn't yet paid the invoice, for example. Also, if we bring it back to a intercultural communication context, some cultures are very sensitive about losing face or being embarrassed in front of other people. So when you directly blame someone for having done something, that can cause them to lose face. So you can express things in a way that are not so direct and personal. One way of doing that, like you beautifully said, is the passive. Another example I could give in using the passive is if for some reason you have the feeling that your counterpart hasn't understood what you wanted to say or has missed an important piece of information, it would be very direct and possibly quite rude to say, you didn't get my point, or you're not listening, or something like that. That is that's an indictment on the other
Yes.
person, very
Yeah.
blaming and accusatory. So you could say something like, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. It doesn't point the finger. It is very neutral. It simply points out the fact that there's you've got signals or you've got your lines crossed somehow, right? So
And it's
not
like,
necessarily,
well, it's like as well saying, instead of saying, you haven't paid your invoice,
right.
started saying, unfortunately, the invoices haven't been settled yet. Settled is another high level word. Use of the passive, use of unfortunately. Um, there are multiple tools
Correct.
here, all in one sentence.
That's right. That's right. And this is a lot of what we train
Yeah.
in our business English courses where we train at companies, right, Nick? So we spend a lot of time working on this, and it just takes a little bit of practice. But then you can use the passive voice, you can use modals, you can use little introductory phrases to warn that, some bad news is coming or something like that. And you can also use softener words like slightly, rather, quite, just to take the directness of the statement down a little bit and soften the message. And then everyone feels comfortable and hopefully, yeah, safe. So,
Exactly.
yes. Yes. Well, I think
So
that's about all of our tips today
I think
for
there are a lot of
the use
nice
of
tips there.
formality.
Yes,
Hmm.
very much
Hmm.
so, Britt. Yes, I would agree with you. So
I love it.
our viewers have certainly been treated to lots of tips today. And Britt, do we have a next topic?
Well, I don't think we've discussed that yet, Nick. I
Does
guess
it
our
matter?
viewers,
No,
not
no,
really,
no.
not really. Our viewers will just have to tune into the next episode for some surprise tips
Yes,
about some aspect of the English language. But as always, this has been lots of fun. And I really, really hope that the viewers get to take away some great tips. So I'll be looking forward to our next episode, Nick.
me too. Exactly. I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to it as well.
Yeah, well, that was another episode of English Unplugged. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channels. That will help us grow and put out a few more tips on a more regular basis to other language learners like you. Take care,
Exactly.
Nick. Have a
Thank you
wonderful
very much for your time,
day.
Britt. Lovely to see you again. And thank you for all the viewers who will eventually watch this video. Don't forget to follow us on social media. Pop us an email. We always liked hearing from you. And from my side, thank you, Britt. See you next time.
See you next time, Nick. Take care.
Bye
Thanks,
bye.
everybody. Bye bye.